This is the What Just Happened series of the Just Security podcast. I'm David Aaron. The goal of the What Just Happened series is to explain the background and implications of legal and policy developments that may not be immediately apparent. We bring our own national security and government experience to the table and bring in guests to share theirs. With that collective experience, we can shed light on the significance of events in the news. In this episode, we will discuss the use of federal authorities to support or control local law enforcement. The executive branch of the federal government recently took several actions relating to law enforcement in Washington, D.C. Specifically, it took over command of the local police department, assigned federal law enforcement officers to the area, and deployed units of the National Guard to the streets of D.C. In the United States, there's a long tradition of putting most police power in state and local law enforcement agencies. Federal law enforcement agencies have specific authorities that are consistent with the powers of the federal government overall. For example, when crimes have an interstate aspect or directly affect a federal interest, federal law enforcement may have jurisdiction. There are also long-standing limits on using military forces for domestic law enforcement. We'll talk to our guests about the legal justifications for the recent actions of the executive branch, the legal limits on those actions, remedies for violations of those limits, and open questions that we're keeping our eye on. And we couldn't have better guests to talk to about this. Carrie Cordero is a senior fellow and general counsel at the Center for a New American Security, a bipartisan national security, foreign policy, and defense think tank in D.C., and a CNN legal and national security analyst. Carrie previously held a variety of legal positions within the federal government and is a former colleague of mine at the Department of Justice. Carrie and the Center for a New American Security have produced several reports relevant to our topics today, which we'll include in the show notes. Donell Harvin is a visiting fellow at the National Security Institute at George Mason University and serves on the faculty at Georgetown University. Donell previously served as the Chief of Homeland Security and Intelligence for the Washington, D.C. Homeland Security and Emergency Management Agency, among many other public safety positions in federal and local government and international organizations. Donell is a Homeland Security analyst at MSNBC. Carrie, Donell, thank you for being here. Just to get us started, when I saw the FBI and National Guard being sent to D.C., my mind went to the immediate post-9/11 period in Lower Manhattan, where I was living and working at the DA's office. There was certainly some comfort in seeing a massive protective presence downtown, although it felt odd to show ID to enter certain parts of my neighborhood, and there were probably a lot of people who experienced all of that quite differently than I did. But one memory that stands out was a conversation I had with an NYPD detective whose son lived upstate and was a member of the Guard, and he was assigned to patrol the subways in Grand Central Station. And this detective was worried that his son's unit had not been trained for law enforcement, and they didn't know New York City, and that they were even carrying the wrong equipment and firearms for urban law enforcement. We wondered together how Guard members from out of state might react to behavior that might seem threatening to them, but that a New York City police officer would consider just another Wednesday. As we talk about the legal issues of the recent actions in D.C., I'm interested in how those kinds of considerations factor in. Carrie, listeners may not distinguish between federal law enforcement officers, such as FBI agents or DEA agents, and local law enforcement officers like detectives and patrol officers. They may not be familiar with National Guard responsibilities and training. So just to set the scene, can you talk about National Guard training and experience in law enforcement and what their mission in that regard is?
Sure. Thanks, David. It's great to be reunited with my former DOJ colleague here and to join Donell as well in this conversation. So just to set the stage a little bit, I think it's useful to distinguish just at a really general level differences between what local law enforcement does versus what different functions that the federal law enforcement folks engage in versus National Guard, because as a general matter, those are really different missions. Those are different ways that those professionals are trained, and they have different day-to-day experience. So as a general matter and constitutionally, law enforcement, public safety is generally under the purview of local and state officials. And so we're all familiar on a daily basis with the types of activities that are local police and state and local law enforcement engage in, whether it's crime, traffic, policing, security, and then of course some local and state crime investigative work. Federal government, of course, there's a range of federal law enforcement personnel. So, Dave, you and I worked at the Justice Department together, where we worked with FBI agents routinely. And so, FBI agents are primarily investigators. They are 1811, so they have law enforcement uh, authorities, but they are conducting investigations, and that investigation ranges from whatever their particular priorities are at sort of a given era or moment in time. But it's from complex criminal investigations, violent crime, white collar crime, and of course, issues that you and I, Dave, worked on in the national security space, counterintelligence, counterterrorism, cybersecurity. And so there's a whole range of public corruption, there's a whole range of federal investigative work that they do. And then, of course, there's other federal agencies within the department, the ATF, the DEA. And then now, what I think people don't always appreciate is the vast law enforcement personnel that are assigned to the Department of Homeland Security over the last 20 years, which really, in terms of numbers of federal law enforcement personnel, eclipses the Justice Department. And so when we combine Border Patrol, ICE, which has their investigative and immigration enforcement agents, Secret Service, and some other sort of law enforcement spread across the Department of Homeland Security. They have a really robust and a robust capacity, robust number of personnel that are law enforcement officers in the department, and a really, really wide breadth of legal authorities that they fall under and that they view as the basis for their activity. So ICE in particular takes a very wide interpretation of the federal statutes that they are authorized to investigate and enforce. And then you've got the National Guard, and the National Guard can be used and called up. It's a military force, but it can be used and called up in a few different capacities. We can get into these more maybe a little bit later, but just in terms of a very brief snapshot, National Guard is primarily a state-based and state command military force under the control of the governor that's there available to engage in state missions. They also can be federalized. And so obviously we'll get more into what the contours of what that looks like, but they can be federalized to engage in federal missions. And then there's also a provision where a National Guard can be engaged in a federal mission, have federal funding, but be still in the command and control of the governor. And so there's a wide range of areas, and some of the work that we've done at CNAS has highlighted recently the expanding missions of the National Guard. So I'll pause there, and then we'll take it from there.
Excellent. Thank you. Donell, can you speak to just the training and expertise of federal law enforcement officers as opposed to state and local law enforcement officers? What differences there might be in what they do day to day?
Thanks for that question, David, and Carrie really laid out a good foundation for this discussion. So I was actually trained as a local police officer. I actually went through the DC Metropolitan Police Academy, spent 7 months doing the same thing that every other police officer that patrols the streets of Washington, DC does. And I also, throughout my career, worked with federal law enforcement very closely. I did forensics, led forensics in New York City and DC, and so worked really closely with the FBI and have family members that are in the federal law enforcement. And I think the biggest difference is, the tactics and techniques that law enforcement learns, the Constitution, laws, enforcement, the basic fundamentals are there, whether you're going to the FBI Academy or the DC Police Academy. I think where they diverge is we spent a lot of time in the DC Police Academy, and I actually taught in the NYPD Academy as well, so I know this for certain, that state and local law enforcement academies spend a lot of time in compassionate community policing, right? They spend a lot of time telling and teaching new cadets how to patrol the neighborhoods, how to enforce local and state laws, and how to do so with something that we would call discretion, right? That's something big. David, you get pulled over by a state trooper, you talk with him or her really nice, you apologize, you may get off with a warning, right? That's called trooper discretion, right? And so when to use certain powers, when not to use it. There's a saying that I learned in the academy, and it's something I would love the White House to really hear, is just because you can do it doesn't mean that you should do it. And I'm not saying that the federal law enforcement aren't learning that, but they're not learning community policing. And community policing is squarely and wholly about making the community feel safe and doing so in a manner that they trust you, right? When my friends go to train in Quantico, to become FBI agents, they're not learning how to do community policing. They're not learning how to gain the trust of the communities that they're patrolling because they're not patrolling communities. And so we're talking about law enforcement as a big umbrella, but specifically when we're talking about state and local law enforcement, we're talking about policing at the community level. And I think that's the difference.
That's interesting. I guess if an FBI agent is going to have contact with a member of the community, they've probably been planning that contact for some time. They're not patrolling the street and having that
And they're
conversation.
not, an FBI agent walks to your walks and does a knock up on your door. There's very little discretion at that point, right, David? They're not saying, well, we may let you get away with this crime because they're not dealing with those levels of crimes, right? They're dealing with I mean, and Carrie can talk us through this more. They're dealing with major crimes, many crimes that occur across state lines. They really don't have that discretion. They're not, making the difference between the decision between stopping someone that's jaywalking or have a broken tail light. Those aren't the type of things that they're dealing with.
They're looking to make a federal case out of it, right,
Correct.
Carrie?
And just to add to that, and I know we'll get into sort of the recent developments in DC here in a sec, but it's worth highlighting that federal, state, local law enforcement has a long, long tradition and daily practice, established practice, irrespective of politics, irrespective of, particular leaders of government agencies, of collaborating, cooperating, and working together in partnership every single day. And that can range from particularly, longstanding task forces that exist under the Justice Department umbrella for organized crime and drug enforcement. I mean, these task forces go back decades. The federal law enforcement community partnering with state and locals to do that type of work and to surge capacity in a particular city when there's a particular spike in that type of complex criminal activity is like bread and butter for the Justice Department and for state and local law enforcement. Similarly, I would say, particularly, David, you mentioned the 9/11 era, particularly in the post 9/11 era, huge increases in coordination, planning, partnership, and security events. So, the idea that federal and there is no such thing that's federal and state, aren't used to working together. I think what's different, and we'll get to it in this current situation, is sort of the command and control questions, because usually state and locals are used to, accustomed, and have been doing it a long time in terms of working together to tackle certain threats. But it's not the everyday street corner policing that Donell's talking about.
And I want to buttress what Carrie said just by mentioning, in the course of a state or local law enforcement's work, they may come across a suspect that may have violated a federal law and they don't have jurisdiction. There's a really easy, clear pathway to refer that to their federal law enforcement partners and vice versa. Right. And so that coordination, when they understand each other's jurisdiction and each other's laws and who's best to enforce those and refer those to, happens on a daily basis.
Absolutely. So maybe one of the questions here is, well, one question is the command and control issue that Carrie just mentioned, and the other is at a tactical level, how does the cooperation or support that we're seeing in DC now differ from the task force models or other, fusion center cooperation models that you guys have talked about? And, is that a good use, the best use, an effective use of federal law enforcement expertise, if they are in fact being put on the street with patrol officers as opposed to, coordinating efforts through task forces? I think part of that remains to be seen.
I'll take a crack at that. Having been on the JTTF, which is the Joint Terrorism Task Force in New York, in New York and DC, I will tell you that the task force model, that as Carrie has talked about before, works very effectively, particularly post 9/11. There's various task force. We have HIDA, which is a high drug trafficking areas that federal, state, and local law enforcement collaborate really for drug trafficking. There's also the JTTFs that we talked about, and those are in the big target cities, New York, LA, so forth and so on. Those are defined missions with defined scope. And I think the main difference is each one of those partners on those task force see each other as equals, right? And so and having been sitting in those rooms, it doesn't matter what badge you wear, you're all equals, you all have your mission, and it's a shared mission. I think the difference is what you're seeing right now is it's quite interesting. I'm not quite sure the federal government sees the DC Police Department as equals or partners in this prospect. And so I really, and we'll get to like the underlying reasons for all this and what we're talking about. But I think the task force model where, state, federal, local come together on one room under one roof and work together collaboratively towards a common goal is not quite here yet. It may get there. All right. They have 30 days to work this out, maybe even longer. But we're just into this for a few days, and I don't think it's right there yet.
All right. So that's the federal law enforcement side. And before we get into the legal structures for this, let's just talk a little bit about the difference between the National Guard, a National Guard unit, and a law enforcement department. We'll get to the legal authorities for this in a moment, but just in terms of training, mission, experience, readiness, Carrie, do you have insight into how a National Guard unit would compare to a local law enforcement agency?
Sure. So again, National Guard is a military force, and it is commanded as a default. It is part of the state command structure. So the governor is the commander in chief of a particular National Guard. Now, DC is the anomaly because in the case of DC, which is why this is different, for example, than the situation that we saw earlier this year in LA with the deployment of National Guard and even some active duty personnel to LA in the context of protest activity. DC is different because the president is always the commander of the DC National Guard. So that's why DC offers this sort of different situation. With National Guard generally, again, there's different ways in which they can be used, but what our research at CNAS has shown and what we've written about is that the missions of the National Guard really are expanding, and the types of things that National Guard are being called upon to do are expanding. One of the most visible things that citizens out in the country might see is the use of National Guard in emergencies, natural disasters, fire season, hurricanes, all those sorts of things where the National Guard is immediately called upon to assist in those particular situations where it's something that's beyond, it's not law enforcement, it's beyond the scope of something that a police agency is engaged in, and it's not really their mission, but it's an area where National Guard is sort of equipped, has the equipment, has the training to be able to respond and assist in that way. So that's a state function. We also have National Guard where, we've talked about sort of in the post 9/11 era, and there was a war in Afghanistan, there's a war in Iraq, and so National Guard over the last 25 years has been called upon periodically to actually fight our wars. And that's where I think, and when I look at this, both from a law enforcement perspective, but also from a national security perspective, where as a policy matter, we really have to be thinking of how we are stretching our National Guard across the country, whether it's in the states or whether it's DC under this different legal structure. Because if we're going to be calling upon the Guard potentially to be ready to fight wars, then that's one set of capabilities, training, types of personnel that are signing up, and the training that they're engaged in, the skills that they're given to be able to be in a position to be called up to actually be at the president's disposal in a federal capacity to fight alongside and serve in military functions alongside the active duty personnel. Then we have this other area, as I mentioned, natural disasters, a growing, and weather emergencies, growing area where National Guard really have filled a unique role. National Guard served a really important role during the pandemic in assisting the rollout of vaccines. And so they have sort of unique logistic capabilities and abilities to be able to assist the country in those types of missions. Then there's these other types of capacities, and we're actually seeing it at both the federal level and the state level, that they're being called upon to do things that really are outside the scope of sort of traditional areas. So one is law enforcement, and President Trump is obviously very quick to call on National Guard to be deployed for law enforcement purposes. And another area, though, that we're seeing at the state level is there have been governors who have been calling on National Guard to do all sorts of other things. Assist with prison security, for example, in, I think it was the state of New York. Assist, I read one report where National Guard was called upon to supplement teaching abilities in a particular state or locality. So if they're going to be stretched to be doing these other types of functions, then that potentially raises a national security issue because it affects their readiness to be called upon in an actual national security emergency where they're needed, or an emergency response. And the one other function that I'll just mention, Dave, before we move on, is cybersecurity. And there are, in some of the states, there are pretty robust, growing, and developed cybersecurity expertise capabilities of National Guard personnel. And given that that is sort of a hybrid federal, industry, state, local issue, it's an area that I potentially see as a growth area for the National Guard. But if they're being called upon to police streets, again, we get into this issue of like, well, what are they being trained to do? What types of skill sets are we looking for? And so I just have an overall concern that we're stretching our Guard too thin. And really, we need to, at both from the state level and at the federal level, be looking at what are the modern uses of how the National Guard can uniquely supplement national and state missions, and then how can we best train them to do those functions. And policing isn't necessarily one of those missions, in my view.
Can I add something to that, David?
Of course.
So I think that Carrie's spot on with that, and I just want to add something to what she said about stretching the National Guard. The former FEMA administrator, Deanne Criswell, actually warned about this in writings and memos about the over-reliance on National Guard for a whole host of things. She just checked off all of those, but I would add disaster response as well. And so in the event that we get engaged as a nation in a hot war overseas and the National Guard is called out, we have basically used them for just about everything you can imagine and some things you can't imagine. And if they're deployed overseas, where does that leave us? And so that was the message that Deanne had sent to the Emergency Management Homeland Security, that we really need to start thinking about a true civil defense that's not deployable off our shores. I think that the model that has been effective in terms of policing for the National Guard, and I want to be on record, they're not a police force, nor should they be. But I think that the model that I like that's been pretty effective was a post 9/11 model that was established in New York City that we started seeing in the mid 2000s, early to mid 2000s, was this Joint Task Force Empire Shield. And that's a combination of National Guard troops from Army, Air Force, Navy, and they're tasked specifically with roving patrols and loitering patrols at critical infrastructure locations in New York City. So if you go to the city, you'll see them at Grand Central, you'll see them at Port Authority, you'll see them at some bridges and tunnels, and they are armed, right? But they're a force multiplier to NYPD, always has been, always will be, and they're more of a deterrent than a policing force, if that makes any sense. And so what you see now is National Guard on the mall, and we'll get to this, with I guess it's just a physical visual deterrent, unarmed, but it's completely different than what we're seeing with Joint Task Force Empire Shield. The last thing I'll mention, because you mentioned training, that the National Guard is not trained in policing. Now, there are some National Guard units that are military police units, and they're trained in military policing, which is essentially force protection and enforcing laws and securing military installations, which is completely different than the policing we're talking about. We're talking about policing cities. The closest thing that we have seen National Guard units pulled out to help police cities during times of civil unrest would be the National Guard CDU units, which are civil disturbance units. And these are the National Guards that you may recall when Trump in his first presidency had the clearing in front of the church. These individuals were called out. They're not armed. They have batons and shields, and they're really trained as, once again, as a force multiplier to law enforcement agents. Because the last thing I will say is they cannot effect arrest. They cannot book people. They can't go to a judge or into a court and testify like a law enforcement officer would. They don't have police powers except on military installations. And so I would add that to the discussion that they're really, really limited, and it really places them at a disadvantage, I'm sure.
So when you were talking about the similarities in some of the training in local and federal law enforcement, Miranda, seizure of evidence, how to make an arrest, all of that, that's beyond the scope. Given the list that you and Carrie have given us of all the other responsibilities of National Guardsmen, Miranda and other criminal procedure, that's pretty far down the list, and the community policing training that you described. All right, so that's the practicalities of the different law enforcement models. We should take a look at the legal structures that govern the various moves that the administration has taken. I think first we can talk about the federal government taking control of the police department in DC, known as the Metropolitan Police. The administration invoked Section 740 of the Home Rule Act, which provides that if the president determines that special conditions of an emergency nature exist, require the use of the Metropolitan Police Force for federal purposes, he can take control over the department for either up to 30 days or the duration of the emergency, whichever comes first, with the shorter of those two periods. Carrie, legally, and as someone who spent some time in DC, do you have any view as to whether an emergency, as the statute requires, exists, or how do we even measure that?
Yeah, so I think that's, it's a great question, David. And my guess is that it will end up getting litigated, perhaps, like many of these other types of exercises of authority that the president engages in. So on its face, I mean, there is an actual statute. I think, we can look to the fact that there is actually a statutory authority under which the president has federalized the Metropolitan Police Department, the MPD. On its face, he has that authority. He's implemented the federal commissioner. We'll see as a practical matter how that plays out in terms of command and control of the MPD. And so then the question becomes, well, is the emergency provision satisfied? And assuming that this will be challenged, I think it's quite possible that courts that generally do give deference to a president, especially if he appeals all the way up. Generally, courts give deference to the president when he's making determinations about emergencies. I mean, there's on the federal side, we have all sorts of federal emergencies that are declared. They rarely get, and they're under a different statutory authority, but they rarely get called back. And the president has pretty broad discretion to describe that. To characterize that. Whether or not the current present day August 2025 situation constitutes an emergency is difficult to analyze because, number one, as far as I understand, this is the first time that this particular provision has been exercised. So there's nothing historically to look back on to compare it to in terms of other situations. For example, by way of example, we can look at, okay, when a president invokes the Insurrection Act to deploy National Guard, we can look back to the 1990s and when it was done before. And so there are actually some modern examples. In this particular case, I don't think there are examples. I will note, David, that in the public and media reaction to his invocation of this, I think given if we look at the statistics of what the crime is and the crime rates over the last 20 to 25 years, those statistics can be interpreted in different ways. One can look at them and make the argument that there is not an emergency because one can look and say, okay, well, homicide rates are down from last year. And so that might lend to the argument that no, there's not any kind of emergency situation justifying this action. On the other hand, as someone who has worked in DC and long ago lived there, but worked there for almost the better part of almost 30 years, there is no one I know who doesn't have some anecdotal example of instances of personal safety concern or exposure to crime over the last few years. And the claim that currently the homicide rates, for example, are down compared to last year leaves out the data point that last year or the year before, 2023 or so, statistics aren't very good and were as bad as they were 20 years ago. So in other words, the chart goes up and down over the last 20 years. And in my judgment, under no objective standard can one look at the particular, either the statistics or particular heinous instances of shootings of innocent victims that have taken place in the last year and say that that's an okay situation. So I think the difficulty is that because President Trump takes this sort of extreme action, using his legal authorities to the maximum extent possible, the reaction of that, unfortunately, doesn't then leave room for acknowledgement, I think, in some of the debate this past week, that, well, maybe actually the crime statistics and the nature of criminal activity in the district is simply unacceptable for people who live there and work there every day.
And for the seat of government, part of the idea of this provision of the Home Rule Act, right, is the government, the federal government, being able to provide an appropriate environment, where government happens. I mean, in that.
Yeah, and so it's no coincidence that he is calling upon this authority, this extreme authority, again, under circumstances when a young congressional intern was killed last month, when a senior government official was killed last year, literally just, parked outside picking his wife up, in his car in a major downtown area of DC. So there are specific instances that can be pointed to of government officials. Now, do I think that is exactly why the president goes to this extreme use of authority? perhaps or perhaps not, but I do think that there is a real conversation, a substantive, not reactionary conversation to be had. And then we can, you can get into, well, then what are the ways to solve that? And, I've put out policy recommendations that focus on actually ways where federal government law enforcement support to local, it might be a better path than using National Guard, which I view as not the appropriate way to supplement local or state law enforcement, except in very extreme situations.
Interesting. Donell, any additional view on whether we have an emergency in DC, and are statistics the right way to measure that when the purpose of assessing whether there's an emergency in part is the need or appropriateness of federal intervention for a defined period in law enforcement?
Regular people like us at the bottom of the mountain can't really judge what the person at the top of the mountain decides is an emergency or not. I guess that's going to be between the administration and the courts. The declaration of the emergency is just a useful excuse. If there is an emergency, statistically speaking, and I'm an epidemiologist, so I like my numbers. There was an emergency during the first Trump presidency, right? Because the crime now is tracking what it was, 2017, 2018, 2019. So it begs the question, why didn't he declare an emergency then? He didn't do it then because Carrie alluded, because of all these anecdotes that have been coming out, right? I think the straw that broke the proverbial camel's back was the attack on the 19-year-old former Doge worker who was nearly carjacked. Meanwhile, other people had been carjacked or nearly carjacked since this year, and it didn't really do anything for him. And so for him, for me, I think that this is a lot of politics. Um, I also think that he has taken this as an opportunity to lump other things that have nothing to do with crime into this initiative, right? And so, and then you have, there will be no homelessness, right? Homelessness and crime are two different things. Now, and anyone who's been in this business long enough, and you guys know this, knows that the way to fight homelessness is not with law enforcement, right? Um, juvenile crime is different than some of these other crimes we're talking about. And so, but, if all you have and all you'd like to use is a hammer, then every problem is a nail, right? And so, putting more men and women out there on the streets with guns and armored vests and armored personnel carriers is not going to solve homelessness. It's not going to solve youth violence, right? It may detract some people from doing some of the carjackings and the things that were talked about, that how we got here. But at the end of the day, that's not long-term solutions. Long-term solutions are social problems. We all know this. This works in conjunction with law enforcement, good law enforcement, and statistics. But in my professional opinion, this is a 100% concocted emergency.
All right. So, I mean, as it relates to the use of federal resources, we may be looking at a misallocation or kind of a solution that's not tailored to the problem. Um, so all right. I think we have slightly differing views or room for analysis about whether an emergency exists, whether it's the type of emergency envisioned by the statute, and whether this particular type of emergency calls for this solution. Carrie, you talked about the possibility of litigation, and whether the courts would be deferential to an executive finding of an emergency. At least, and I'll note for the audience that we're in day 1 or 2 of the 30-day maximum period. So, we'll see how things play out. Assuming that control over the police department does not extend beyond 30 days. And if litigation began before that 30-day clock ran out, do you think judges would be inclined to let the 30-day period run rather than even look at the merits of a litigation over whether an emergency exists?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, there's no way the litigation takes place before the 30 days, runs its course before the 30 days is up. So it may be that that then that as a practical matter, maybe one way to answer this is we actually gamed this out a little bit, in a way, in a scenario that we ran at CNAS last year, where we were looking at, actually, in that case, it was deployment of the National Guard, and if the president and a governor disagreed about it, and one of the findings from that report was that litigation is going to happen, but it's never going to solve the actual public safety problem. So in that scenario that we gamed out, it was about deploying National Guard in a protest scenario, and what we found was that there can be litigation, but the actual practical situation on the ground, litigation is not going to be able to address it. So when I look at this, I'm sort of less concerned about the litigation timetable than I am thinking about policy recommendations for what are some other ways that this could be approached. When I look at the local law enforcement piece in DC, the MPD is understaffed for years. Like, it needs more money. And these are things that Congress can do. It needs more money. It needs more people. It needs more attention to the training and the capabilities of the MPD. So that is a productive area that the president could work with Congress and work with the mayor to actually get done, to bolster the capacities and the abilities of MPD to better serve the city in the future. If we're looking at then ways to supplement local law enforcement, I did read a report that the administration is looking at potentially having quick reaction forces comprised of National Guard personnel that are able to deploy. I would much rather see that be from a policy perspective, a quick reaction force comprised of federal law enforcement personnel who are positioned to be able to respond. Number one, you can do that based on federal law enforcement officers who are already pre-deployed in cities and doing their work already in cities around the country. Number two, those task forces and relationships already exist. Number three, they're trained in Miranda, they're trained in Fourth Amendment, they're trained in First Amendment, like they're trained in the constitutional protections that are involved in law enforcement in a way that National Guard are not necessarily trained as much. So, those are a couple things that I think as a practical matter would be more effective ways to address the security situation in DC in the longer term.
Yeah, and I think from a litigation perspective, while it's possible that a temporary restraining order could come out quickly enough, within that 30-day period, I do wonder whether a judge would do that, would look at a president's determination of whether there's an emergency rather than let the 30-day period run. I think on day 31, if the command has not been returned to the city, we might see a different litigation posture. I want to move on in the time we have left just to the, from the command and control over the DC police, back to the supplementing with National Guard and federal law enforcement. Those supplements or those deployments obviously are not subject to a 30-day limit. And those can be very visible presences in the city. You got the National Guard, wearing military uniforms essentially. And Carrie, you referenced the ICE forces. They're not wearing jackets and ties on the street. They're dressed tactically as well. I'm wondering, Donell, do you see a possibility of mission creep in this deployment, whereas there might be an entirely appropriate exercise of federal law enforcement authority, Title 32 authority by the Guard, but you've got people in a city charged with keeping that city safe or stable. Could their role expand either anecdotally, one-off, or more strategically? And to what effect, just getting back into the legal implications of this, to what effect, to what extent could that affect the exercise of First Amendment rights?
Well, you hit the nail on the head. And the reason why I say that is because we're all analyzing the White House's checker move, but they're playing chess, right? And so I don't see this as a means to the ends. I see this as a really a first step into a longer process. And I've been on the ground in DC when we've had these discussions. Um, I don't see a scenario in which this wraps up in 30 days. And the reason why I say that is because Pam Bondi got on the air during the presser, White House, and said, today crime ends in DC. Well, that's a pretty lofty goal, right? For me, that would infer zero crime. I don't know how you get to that. No city in any country is able to achieve that, but you can't promise that and then pull out in 30 days and have a headline that someone gets carjacked or shot the next day, right? And so they've almost painted themselves into a position that they have to maintain this kind of siege. Now, what does that set up? I actually believe in President, when I was in the Bowser administration, back before when we had this discussion, we had these discussions about there was threats then about taking over the MPD. I believe that the White House is doing this because they can, but I also think that they're doing this to establish the processes for doing this in the future. Should you have widespread civil unrest, such as what we had in 2020 come to the district, perhaps a SCOTUS ruling that many people don't like, hint, hint. And so if you have the pathways and understand the levers to pull to rapidly deploy federal assets and to take over the DC Guard, if the courts have already declared that it's been approved and you're doing it so legally, then you have a blueprint to do that already. So I actually think that this isn't about crime today. I think that the anecdotes that we've talked about that got us here were useful in the justification. I think this is setting up a precedent and a pathway to really own the security of the District of Columbia for a future event that hasn't unfolded yet.
Well, thank you. I think it's a little less clear what the boundaries of the legal authorities are when it comes to use of federal law enforcement officers or even the Guard in DC in particular. And I think we'll be keeping an eye here, and hopefully we'll have you guys back to talk about how this has played out, whether legal lines have been crossed, whether those can be addressed on a policy level, as Carrie suggests, or whether litigation is necessary or is even an option. But thank you both very much for this discussion. Again, we're early in the 30-day period, and we'll be checking in as time goes forward. This episode was hosted by me, David Aaron, and produced by Maya Neer with help from Isaac Rubenstein. Special thanks to our guests, Carrie Cordero and Donell Harvin. You can read all of Just Security's coverage of this and other topics on our website. And if you enjoyed this episode, please give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Thank you.